Uh, so let's start with Kitab Al-Fatiha. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Ar-Rahim Maliki Yawmiddin. Iyyaka na'budu wa iyyaka nasta'in. Ihdinas siratal mustaqim. Siratal ladzina an'amta 'alaihim ghairil maghdubi 'alaihim waladdallin. Amin. Okay, before I start the lecture, is there any questions related to the subject, related to the topics or the assignments that you have been doing maybe, or the topics that we have covered so far? Okay. Okay. So can you see the screen that I've shared?
Yes, doctor.
Okay. Thank you. Okay, so I've already uploaded the slides. Yeah. So I think this one. Oh, it's this one. Let me just rename it. So actually, yeah. So actually, it's supposed to be topic 10, but I think I want to cover another topic in place of topic 10 for this semester. So we'll skip topic 10. So in the course outline, you see topic 10 as aggregate expenditure, the aggregate expenditure model, but I think it is sort of already covered in some ways. So I just want to cover aggregate demand and aggregate supply, and then depending on the situation later, maybe I want to discuss another topic that I think is more relevant, especially in terms of the application. Okay, that is related to development and also poverty. Okay, so that's something that I wish to cover for this semester. Okay, so you can get the slides there, topic 11. Okay, and then just another also a gentle reminder. Yeah, your assignments will be due by the end of the month, so May 30th. So there will be 2 assignments. Okay, there will be 2 assignments that will be due. So I highly recommend that you start doing either one and finish that one first, submit, stop thinking about it, and you can focus on the other one. Okay, so if you have not yet started your assignment, I highly recommend at least open a Microsoft Word document and start to type any thoughts, any initial thoughts from what you've observed or from what you read from the instructions. Okay, so that is a good start. At least you already open a document, you write your initial thoughts and you save that document, so you know that is something that you have kept in mind. Okay, so these 2 will be due at the same time. Okay, so it is highly recommended start one and finish it immediately, and then you can focus on the other. Okay, so it's not far away, it's less than 2 weeks. Okay, so today is already 18th, so you have around 11 or 12 days, okay, to submit this. Okay, so to be fair for the students that submit on time, if you submit later than the due date, I will deduct 5 marks for each day that you are late to submit. Okay, so I think that should be fair for everyone, right? So, and then I've already reminded you, so hopefully you can start to think about this assignment. Okay, so if there's no questions to be asked or anything to share, I will start the lecture. Yeah. Okay, so the focus for today, okay, will be this topic. Okay, the topic of aggregate demand and aggregate supply. Okay, so this is similar to demand and supply that we've learned previously, right? So previously we already talked about demand and supply. We know the demand curve, the supply curve, but for today is basically what we learn is aggregate demand. So aggregate here, okay, the keyword here in terms of aggregate is basically adding everything together. Okay, so the previous demand and supply that we've learned is individual demand and supply, right? So now, because we are looking from the perspective of macroeconomics, we are adding everyone's demand together and making it into an aggregate. Okay, so you make it, you analyze the demand from the perspective of everyone's demand, right? So that's aggregate demand and aggregate supply, right? And as we will see later, if you remember, okay, if you remember, demand curve is downward sloping. Okay, so I think, let me just draw this again. I think this is one of the most important figures in economics. Right? It is the demand and supply curve, and you have to remember here on the on this axis, this is the price. Okay, this is price, and this is quantity. Okay, and the demand curve is downward sloping. Okay, so remember demand D, so it's always downward sloping, and supply curve is usually upward sloping, so it goes up. Okay, so when we will see later on, okay, commonly the shape of aggregate demand and aggregate supply, aggregate demand and demand is the same, right? So usually in terms of aggregate demand, it looks like this, and aggregate supply, depending on the time period, it also looks like this. So it's more or less the same in terms of downward sloping and upward sloping, but the principles will be different. The factors that influence the shape will be different, right? So there are different factors that we will see later on, and basically these are the content that we will cover for this topic. Okay, so we look at aggregate demand. Okay, and as we will see later, okay, aggregate demand in terms of macroeconomy, usually we will refer it to a certain country. So when you say aggregate demand, you have to relate it to aggregate demand of what. So usually it is referring to a country, right? So when you add everyone's demand together, at the same time, you will eventually arrive to the conclusion that these are all uh, consumption. Okay, consumption. So consumption represents demand, investment represents demand, government spending represents demand, and net export also represents demand. So it is basically adding all the demand in the economy together, right? And if you realize all these factors, okay, the consumption, investment, government spending, and net export is basically similar to GDP, right? And therefore, when we learn about aggregate demand, okay, you can say you can say that it is similar to GDP, because GDP is just a representation of how much is being produced in a country, and what is being produced usually has a demand, right? So when you add all that together, you can say that AD is also GDP. So there will be many times where GDP and AD will be interchangeable. Okay, so we will look at that later. And then after we look at the factors of AD, after we look at factors of aggregate demand and GDP, okay, we will then cover the aggregate supply. And the shape of the aggregate supply will usually depend on the time period. So that is where the short run or long run comes. Okay, and in economics, usually when we talk about the short run, it is usually referring to less than 1 year. Okay, and in the long run, it is referring to more than 1 year. Okay, so it can be 10 years, 5 years, right? So that's usually the long run. And depending on the time period, what happens, as we will see later, the shape of the aggregate supply will be different. Okay, so these are the topics that we will cover. And this is quite important because it is again related to GDP, right? And as we have made to be understood, basically GDP is the main indicator of a country's economic development. Okay, and if you want to see if usually the indicator, if the country is being developed or not, you look at the GDP figures, right? So you will look at the percentage of growth in terms of the GDP figures. Okay, so these are the topics that we will cover. Okay, any questions before that? Before I continue? You can hear me, yeah?
Yes.
Okay. Okay, so basically, okay, as I mentioned just now, the shape of the aggregate demand is downward sloping. Okay, and this is the price, this is quantity. Okay, and this follows the law of demand, whereby the higher the price, the lower the quantity that is demanded. Okay, so the lower the price, okay, as we see here, price is high, quantity is low at P1 and Q1, price high, quantity low. The more lower we go in terms of the price, okay, P2, Q2, the higher the quantity, right? So this is just the following the law of demand. But basically, there will be changes in aggregate demand. Okay, there will be changes in aggregate demand, and this depends on several factors. Okay, and these factors are basically this abbreviation, these short forms. Okay, basically represented by C. Okay, so C is, again, C is consumption. Okay, consumption plus plus I, which is investment. Investment plus G, which is government spending, plus XN. Okay, here XN, or you can say net exports. Okay. Okay, net exports. Okay, so these are the factors that will affect the position of the aggregate demand curve. Okay, and depending on the value of the CIG and X, okay, it may shift the position of AD, right? So AD can either shift to the right, okay, it can be AD1, or it can be AD2, shifting to the left. Okay, and at these different positions, as you see, at different prices have different quantities, right? So at P1 here, if you go to AD1, you will see that the quantity has changed to Q AD1. So there's the quantity has, although the price is the same, but because of the shift in AD, the quantity has changed, right? And similarly, at P2, okay, you have Q AD2. Okay, the quantity also change, and at AD2 also, you can plot where the quantity is, right? And basically, this shift from AD to AD1 and AD2 depends on the changes of C, the changes of I, the changes of G, the changes of NX. Okay, so usually there might be a change, for example, in the consumption value. Okay, for whatever reason, people may increase their consumption behavior. People may spend more, and depending on the multiplier, it may affect the AD more than the initial change, right? So, and in most cases, in most times, these factors may change, more than one factor, more than one component may change at the same time, right? So maybe there is an increase in, for example, let's say, maybe there is an increase in consumption. At the same time, there is an increase in investment. However, there is a decrease in government spending, and there is an increase in net exports. Right? So you have to calculate all of this, and basically this will determine the position of AD. Right? So an initial change in, for example, let's say we take C first, right? So C, let's say the reasons for C changing consumption, right? It can be maybe there is an increase in income or increase in wealth. Okay. Okay, so let's say consumption increase because of increase in wealth, increase in expectation. Okay, increase in income, increase in wealth, increase in expectation, decrease in debt, and decrease in taxes. So this will increase consumption behavior, right? And for investments, okay, for investment, if usually investments increase if interest rate go down. And I think I covered this last week. When interest rates goes down, investments go up. When interest rates go up, investments go down. Okay. Or maybe there is an increase in technology, okay, that makes the cost of investment cheaper. Okay. Or there is a higher expectation. Okay, better expectation. So this will also increase investment, and there are other factors. Yeah. And when we look at government, maybe government spending may increase if depending on the fiscal policy or increase in budget. Okay, so this can increase government. And then finally, in terms of net exports, okay, net exports can increase because of exchange rate, for example. Okay, so when exchange rate is cheaper, okay, when your home currency is cheaper, more people will buy your goods. Okay, for example, ringgit. Now I think most of us realize ringgit is actually falling. Okay, and this, in terms of economic sense, from an export perspective, it is actually good for exports. Okay, so if Malaysia is producing goods and services and we are selling to other countries, so when our exchange rate goes down, okay, when exchange rate goes down, other countries can buy our goods cheaper. Other countries can buy Malaysian goods at a cheaper price, because now, let's say previously, 100 USD, okay, 100 USD is equal to, let's say 350, sorry. RM 350 ringgit. Okay, but now, so now from let's say something that is valued at, let's say we produce, what do we export? Let's say palm oil. Okay, we export 1 barrel of palm oil. Okay, and let's say for assumption's sake, 1 barrel of palm oil is 350 ringgit. Okay, palm oil. Okay, and now because of the decrease in exchange rate, okay, 100 US dollars is now 400 and no RM 450. Okay, so now instead of 1 palm oil, okay, 1 barrel, the same 100 US dollar, the same 100 USD can buy more than 1 barrel. So it can buy 1 and maybe 1.5, okay, almost 1.5 barrels of palm oil. So now you are selling more in terms of the value of the ringgit. More is being sold because of the lower exchange rate. So in terms of export, lower exchange rate is actually good for exports, right? But of course, there are other considerations. If, for example, we buy imports, right? We buy other from other countries, then we have to pay more. Right? So these are some of considerations, but essentially, net export is export value minus imports. Right? So these basically will then influence the position of aggregate demand. Right? So if consumption increase, investment increase, government spending increase, net export increase, this will then shift the aggregate demand to the right. Right? So it will, when the factors or when the components increase, it will shift the aggregate demand to the right. When they decrease or net decrease, in terms of when you add everything together, it will shift the aggregate demand to the left. Right. So this is how the shift works. Right. And from the initial change, okay, there might be a multiplier effect. Right. So in this example, you see aggregate demand shifting at the dotted line. Okay, the dotted line. Let's assume aggregate demand was at AD1, and there is suddenly a change in consumer spending. So suddenly people are spending more. Okay, so C increase. Okay, so the initial change of C was only this much. Okay, the C increase was only this much. However, because of the multiplier effect, the total shift may be until AD2, right? Because, for example, if you see the policy response during the COVID, right? The governments around the world gave money to people, and basically this caused consumer spending to increase, and because of the multiplier effect, right? So when you spend in the economy, this will give income to businesses, and then businesses will then start to have some cash flow. And when they have cash flow, they can retain workers, and they can rejuvenate their business and start to produce again. And when they start to produce again, they increase their investments, etc., etc. And then this will then rejuvenate the economy and cause that multiplier. Right? Although the initial start is only an increase in C, it may cause other things, right? Because of the interconnectedness, okay, with other factors. Okay, yeah. So this is a representation of the multiplier effect. Okay, so now we'll go through each factor into more detail. I've already touched briefly in the previous slide, but now we'll go into more detail, right? So the first factor in terms of aggregate demand is consumer spending. Okay, consumer spending or consumption. So you can make it interchangeable. Okay, or see here is also consumption. Okay, because when you spend, you are basically consume. Okay, so these are the factors that will influence C. Okay, so factor number 1 is consumer wealth. Okay, so the higher, basically the more wealthier people are, or the more wealthier people feel, the more they will they will consume. Okay. Okay. And vice versa. If consumer wealth goes down, consumption will also go down. Okay. Number 2 here is household borrowing. Okay. Basically, the borrowing is also a component of spending. Okay, because you can borrow in order to spend, right? So the higher household borrows, the higher is the consumption level in the economy. Okay, and this, as you will see, I think we've already touched upon a few times in terms of interest rate. Okay, it is very much related to interest rate. So what happens is that when okay, what happens is that okay, when interest is low, okay, then the cost of funds is lower. Okay, cost of funds is cheaper. Okay, and when cost of funds is cheaper, meaning to say when you go to the bank and you pay a lower interest, so this is interest is the cost of fund, and when the cost of fund is lower, more people will borrow. So borrowing increase, and when you have more borrowing, you have extra money. Okay, and when you have extra money, usually you will increase your consumption. Right, so this is the relationship with interest rate. Okay, and we will cover this later on when we look at monetary policy. Okay, this is very much related to monetary policy. And if you realize, last week, I think the Malaysian Central Bank changed the interest rate, or in other words, the overnight policy rate. Okay, overnight policy rate, they basically increased the interest rate. So this was in order to reduce inflation, and also in order to do so, you have to reduce spending. Okay, so when you increase interest rate, basically there will be less borrowing, and this will eventually cause less spending in the economy. Okay, reduce consumption. Okay, yeah. So, and then there's the third factor that influences consumer spending. Okay, so this is expectation. Okay, so if basically the idea is that if people expect the future, okay, the near future to be good, then they will consume more. But if they think that the near future will be bad, okay, the expectation is bad, then they will reduce their consumption. Because why? For example, you think next month, um, I think my boss will cut my wage, or next month I think I will be fired. So therefore, for this month, I will consume less, because if I spend too much, then I will eat up on my savings, right? So if I think that I will lose my job, then I consume less. But if I think next month, I think my boss will increase my wage, so I can spend more now, and next month's wage will cover current spending. Right? So this is also something that will influence consumer spending. Okay. And then finally, number 4 is personal taxes. So how much you have to pay to the government. Okay. So if taxes go down, okay, so the principle is that taxes go down, then disposable income go up. Okay, disposable income. So let's say, for example, if you have an income of 10,000, and the tax that you have to pay is 10%, right? So you have to pay 1,000. Okay, 1,000. But now, suddenly, the government announced tax is only 5%. So previously, when you pay the tax of 1,000, you have you have disposable income. Okay, disposable income. Income of 9,000. Okay, but now the government announced, okay, now taxes has been reduced and you only pay 5%, which is 500. Therefore, your disposable income has increased to 9,500. Right. So now, because of the decrease in personal tax, you have a higher disposable income, and this basically results to higher consumption because you feel that you have extra money now. Right. So this is the factor that will. These are some of the factors that will influence consumer spending. Of course, there are other factors, but these are the four main factors. Okay. Any questions before I move to the next part? You can hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes, doctor.
Yeah. Okay. The next factor is investment. Yeah, so this is another component of aggregate demand. So investment, represented by I, is influenced primarily by real interest rate. Right? So if you remember last week, in terms of the relationship of interest and investment, okay, so interest is here, investment here. Okay, so basically the curve looks like, sorry, it is a downward sloping curve. Which says that basically the higher the interest rate, okay, so here I1, here's the investment. So the higher the interest rate, the lower is the investment. The lower the interest rate, I2 here, you can see the investment increasing. Okay, so this is real interest rate. So usually during times of low interest rate, you can see a very high level of investment. And we saw last week, basically this is because when business want to invest in something, they will look at the factor of what is the expected return. Okay, expected return versus cost of fund. Okay, so cost of fund is how much do we have to pay if we go borrow at the bank, or how much is the return that we can get if instead of we using the money that we have in the bank, we just leave it there. How much interest do we get? Right, so you have a money in the bank, you can choose. For example, a business has 1 million in the bank, so they can choose to use that 1 million to invest, or they can choose to leave the money in the bank and see what is the interest that they can get, right? So if, for example, the interest that they can get when they leave the money in the bank is 5%, right? And then the expected return, if they spend the money to invest for their business, is only less than 5%. So based on our calculation and projection, if we invest in this project, we can only get a return of 3%. Right? So if the expected return is less than the cost of fund, then the business will not invest. Right? So if the cost of fund is lower, right, the lower the cost of fund, usually the higher the amount of investment because you can get a higher expected return. Right? So the factors that they consider basically as a business, and when you open a business, you will also consider this. If, for example, you do not have any money, you can go to the bank. You can borrow from the bank, and how much the interest that you pay is the cost of fund. Okay, So if, for example, you borrow from the bank 1 million and the cost of fund, which is the interest of 5%, but then you expect from your investment you can get a return of at least 10%, right? So then you can see that, okay, expected return is higher than the cost of fund, then the business will decide to invest, right? So this is what we talked about last week, okay? And this also would basically influence aggregate demand. Okay, so the higher the investment, the higher the aggregate demand in the economy. Okay, so that's factor number one. Okay, in terms of real interest rate. And then another main factor that will influence investment is expectations. Okay, the expected returns, the expectations that will the things that will influence the expected returns are expectations of future business, the technology, degree of excess capacity, how much you can increase your production, right? And then business taxes. So business taxes is really similar to the individual tax that I talked about just now. So the lower the tax, the higher the disposable income of the business, and then they can decide, okay, whether to invest or not. Okay, so these are the factors that influence investment spending that will eventually also influence aggregate demand. Okay, so this is number two. This is factor number two of aggregate demand. Okay, the I. And then factor number three of aggregate demand, okay, here is government spending. Okay, government spending. So usually government spending, you can see this through the government budget. Okay, so usually in I think majority countries around the world, the government will present their budget for the next year. Okay, and you can see the figures. This is the amount that we will expect to spend for next year, and this is the amount that we expect to collect for next year, the tax that we will collect. Okay, and this is basically the budget will show the amount of spending the government will undertake for the year. Okay, and basically this is related to fiscal policy. Okay, how much the government spends and how much the government collects in taxes. Okay, and in some special occasions, the government may also alter their budget. So in Malaysia, we usually have what you call supplementary budget. Okay, suddenly in the middle of the year, the government says, okay, we want to increase our spending. Okay, and we've already tabled our budget in Parliament previously, but now we want to alter that budget, and we have a supplementary budget. Okay, so that increases the government spending. Okay, and what this does is basically when the government spending increases, this will increase aggregate demand. Okay, because this is a component of aggregate demand. Okay, and in the what you call the here, okay, so this happens as long as interest rates and tax rates do not change, right? So this is basically the term ceteris paribus. Okay, or other things being equal, other things do not change. Okay, and for this, for example, where do the government spend it? Okay, they can spend it on various projects, right? So for example, they can allocate spending for a transportation project, right? So maybe they want to build a new railway, they want to build new train stations, right? So these are the things that will be included in the aggregate demand. So this is basically the demand of the demand of the government. Okay, so this is a representation of that demand, and it will also be included in the GDP. Okay, so the aggregate demand is also the GDP. Okay, and then vice versa here, when the government spending decreases, aggregate demand also decreases. Okay, and then you can, for example, the government cut budget for military spending, this will reduce government spending, right? So this is one of the, you can argue, is one of the criticisms of GDP calculation, because when you calculate government spending, for example, and the government spending is on military, and most of the time military equipment uh, is not productive in nature, right? In terms of the sustainability, and you can argue the weapons, for example, when government spend is actually spending on weapons is actually destroying things. Okay, so this is an argument or a criticism of GDP calculation. Okay, so but the idea is that basically when government spending decreases, this also reduces the aggregate demand in the economy. Okay, and then finally, in terms of the fourth component of aggregate demand, the net export, okay, depends on two factors. Okay, what is the income from abroad? So this is usually the amount of money that businesses get when they sell goods abroad to other countries, and also what is the amount of money that is being brought back from expatriates. So if you are an expatriate, or you go um, to another country and you have income from that country, but at the same time when you get income you send the money back home, so this is also part of the income from abroad. Okay, so this basically would influence the aggregate demand. Okay, so the idea is that if exports increase, if exports increase, aggregate demand increase. Okay, and vice versa. Let me just pause for a while for Azan. And if you can think about the any questions that you have. Okay. Okay, let's continue. Yeah. So, okay, I just want to see your thoughts on this, and I've already explained this. Okay, one of the main factors that will influence exports is the exchange rate. Okay, so the question is, what is actually good? Okay, we don't put dollar. Let's say currency. Okay, currency depreciation or currency appreciation. Okay, so I want your thoughts on this. Let me just ask, or if there's anyone that wants to volunteer. So the question is, which do you prefer for your country? Do you prefer your currency to depreciate, or do you prefer your currency to appreciate? Okay, so let me just ask. Brother Bayo, are you there, Brother Bayo?
Yes, doctor.
Okay, so the question is, which do you prefer for your country? Is it currency depreciation or currency appreciation?
I prefer currency depreciation
Why?
because that will increase the exports, like we said.
So what does your country export?
It exports bauxite.
Bauxite, huh?
Yeah,
Which country is the primary buyer of bauxite from your country?
China.
China. So currently, what is the situation in terms of the currency as compared to China?
Um, the situation currently the currency is appreciation appreciating.
Sorry, what country are you from?
Guinea, from West
Guinea, yeah.
Africa. Yeah.
Okay. So China is one of the main buyers, or
Yes.
the main. So they you can argue that China is a foreign investor.
Yes.
Okay. So how about yourself in terms for an individual? Do you prefer your currency to appreciate or depreciate? By the way, what is the name of the currency in Guinea?
Guinean franc.
Guinean franc, huh?
Yeah.
Okay, so it's French. The
Yes.
Still has the French influence.
Yes.
So for yourself, what
For
do you prefer?
myself, I wanted to appreciate.
Okay, so yeah, thank you for sharing. So usually, okay, when we say that currency appreciate or depreciate, yeah, it refers to comparison to a certain other currency, right? For example, Brother Bayo mentioned just now, the depreciation, or yes, currently Guinea franc is appreciating against the Chinese yuan, right, or Chinese renminbi or yuan. Um, but however, it may have a different effect or a different exchange rate to the US dollar. Okay, so if, for example, it appreciates with the yuan, it doesn't mean that it also appreciates with the US dollar. So it depends on what the other currency is also experiencing. Okay, so it's not the same for all the currencies, right? So similarly, for example, the ringgit Malaysia, currently it is depreciating against the US dollar, However, it may not depreciate against other currencies. Right? So this is also a factor. Okay, so depending on the currency that the foreign country is also experiencing, it will also influence the exports, right? So this is something that you have to bear in mind when looking at the influence of exchange rate towards the exports. Okay, so basically, but the premise is that we will then calculate our exports based on our currency. So Malaysia will calculate our exports based on Malaysia ringgit, the ringgit Malaysia, right? So this is the consideration when it comes to net exports. Okay, thank you, Brother Bayo. Okay, any questions before I move to the next part? Okay, so the next part.
So, Doctor, the aggregate demand and GDP, is it the same thing?
Yeah, it is interchangeable. You can argue. Yeah. So basically, you can say AD in this case is GDP. Okay.
Okay.
And we calculate GDP with the same factors that I mentioned: C, I, G, and X. Okay. So this is just basically saying that the GDP, in essence, is actually all the demand that is happening in the economy. Okay, so this demand comes from these factors, and we add all these demands together and we get the aggregate demand. Okay, and basically there are many factors that would influence the okay, so there are factors that would influence the factors that influence aggregate demand, right? So the factors of aggregate demand are the four main things that I mentioned: C, I, G, and X. But for each component, there are other factors that will influence them as well, right? So this is one component of aggregate demand, right? So you have you also have to remember, okay, so this is the next part. Okay, so in an economy, okay, it is not enough to have demand. Okay, so another important component of an economy, you also have to have supply. Okay, so this is where you will see what is the equilibrium point, right? So the equilibrium point is basically when the aggregate demand meets the aggregate supply. So the price is here, the quantity is here. So when they meet each other, this is where
that is this demand and aggregate demand. I see there is not any like much difference. It's just that it deals with macro and this deals with macro, right?
the shape is the same, but when you go back to the notes for demand, okay, what are the factors that influence demand? So
the
you have,
shifters of demand.
yeah, what are the factors of demand?
Yeah, we have consumers change in uh, we're having change in consumer test,
Mm-hmm.
change in number of buyers, change
Mm-hmm.
in
Yeah, so it is different factors. Although you can say in terms of income, it is individual income, but things like government spending is not part of the normal microeconomic demand. Right? So
yeah.
the factors are a bit different.
Okay, I get it.
So, but the shape more or less will be more or less the same, right? But as you mentioned, it is, you can say it's correct to see aggregate demand at the macro level. So it's just a different way of looking at things, and but this, it still follows the law of demand. It still follows the law of demand. Okay, whereby the higher the price, the lower the quantity. The lower the price, the higher the quantity. Okay.
Okay. Yeah.
So the shape is the same. Okay, but the factors that influence the shape are different. Okay, and similarly we will see for supply also, the shape will be more or less the same, but the factors will be different. Okay, and yeah, I think it is good that you can connect the two. You can connect the microeconomic demand and supply with the aggregate demand and supply. So it is quite the same. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, and similar to normal supply, similar to the microeconomic supply, the aggregate supply also depends on the time horizon. Okay, depends on what time are we looking at it. Okay, so it can be in the immediate short run. Okay, immediate short run is like as if you are taking a picture of an event, right? So it's just that one period, that 1 second that you are taking that picture, right? So it's just the immediately after this is the picture, but after that, after the picture is taken, of course other things will happen, right? So it's not the same as if you are taking a video, right? So it's just a snapshot of an event that is happening. Okay, so this is the immediate short run, and then you have the short run, which is less than 1 year, and then long run is more than 1 year. Okay, so the shape in terms of the time horizon is basically how much time can businesses or people who supply, right? So basically the supply are the things that are being produced, right? So you have the demand, right? So the demand is basically, I want something, I want this, I want the goods, I want the services, but the demand cannot be fulfilled if there is no supply, right? So the supply comes from the production, right? So the demand and the supply must match in order to have that equilibrium price, equilibrium level, okay, equilibrium point. Okay, and this is basically, the supply is basically the output that is produced at each price level. Okay, so this is the amount that is being produced. So it's not enough if everyone, all the people say we demand something. So there must also be another side to it. So when you demand something, okay, now this is the supply. Okay, so if the demand is more than the supply, so if everyone demands for something, but the stock cannot fulfill the demand, so this is where the shortage happen. Okay, because everyone demands, for example, everyone demands to buy chicken. Okay, we want to buy chicken, but then there's no stock, so the supply is not there. Right, so there must be a match between demand and also the production. Okay, the output being produced, and this basically is influenced by the time horizon, right? So how long can we prepare to produce more? Okay, so in the immediate short run, for example, everyone is demanding chicken and there's no stock. So immediately during that time, it is the shape of the supply is different. Okay, but after, let's say after a few weeks, we can supply more chicken. So then the shape changes. Okay, and in the long run, you can change more, right? So in the short run, maybe you can increase the amount of eggs that is being hatched and chicken that is being bred, right? But then in the longer run, you can increase the number of chicken farms, right? So the longer the time period, the more flexibility in terms of the factors, okay, in terms of the what you call the fixed factors and the variable factors. So the longer the period, the more variables that you can change. Okay, so this will influence the shape of the supply curve. Okay, so in the immediate short run, this is the shape of the supply curve, whereby the snapshot of the supply curve. Okay, so the supply curve immediately during this time looks like this. Okay, it is a horizontal straight line. Okay, basically it's just showing that at this price level, okay, with output prices that are fixed, this is the supply. Okay, this is the supply during this time. Okay, and in the short run, this is the the shape of the aggregate supply. So this is where you have certain flexibility in terms of changing the supply. Okay, and then yeah, so this one is similar to the normal supply curve that we see, that we've learned previously. And then finally, in the long run, it is a vertical line. Okay, so this is the aggregate supply. So what this shows is that the price level changes do not affect the firm's profit, and therefore there's no incentive for the firm to alter their output. Okay, so this is where um, um, basically in the long run, okay, if you plot the supply, this is where usually the economy has you call a long run output at this point, unless there is some changes to labor and also technology, and then there will be a shift of the aggregate supply curve. So either it can go to the left, it can go, usually if technology improves, the long run supply curve will shift to the right. Okay, okay, and then if there is a various factors, it may shift to the left as well. Okay, but usually this curve in the long run may shift to the right. Okay, so this is it's just something to show you, and it's good to know the shapes that the aggregate supply curve changes as the time period changes. Okay, and these are the factors that will change the aggregate supply. Okay, but moving forward, we will refer to the short run aggregate supply curve, which is the upward sloping curve. Okay, so it's easier to understand. Okay, and basically the changes in the aggregate supply, okay, is determined by other things beside price levels. Okay, so price levels do change the aggregate supply, but in order for the so we have the price here, we have the quantity here, we have the aggregate supply here. Okay, so the price levels will change the aggregate supply, right? At different points you have different quantities. Okay, but the shifts, okay, the causes of aggregate supply shifting to the right or to the left, to AS1 and AS2, there are other factors. Okay, so these are the factors that will shift aggregate supply. Basically, number one, the input prices, right? So for example, if you look at from the perspective of a business, so if you open a company and you open a business, you want to produce something, right? So for example, you open a clothing company, or you produce shirts and pants, right? So your input cost or input price will be the material, right? So what happens is that if the cost of material or the input price increases, this will basically increase the cost of production. Okay, so when your cost of production increases, if other things doesn't change, this will then reduce your supply, because now the input prices are higher. Then for example, you have budgeted every month, for example, you will allocate 100,000 to buy cotton material. Okay, but now and you can get let's say 1 ton of cotton. Okay, but now suddenly the price of cotton, of 1 ton of cotton, increased to 120,000. So now you cannot buy 1 ton of cotton, but maybe 0.8 or 0.9 tons of cotton with the same amount of money that you have budgeted. So now because of that, yeah, you can, let's assume only 0. Sorry, so 120,000 for 1 ton. Yeah, for 1 ton. So if you only have 100,000, maybe then you can only buy 0.8 tons. Okay, so the same amount of money that you have, okay, the same amount of money you have, but you can now the input that you buy is less. So because of that, the amount that you can produce, or in other words, the amount that you can supply in the economy will be less. Okay, so this is the reason, the influence. Okay, so the higher the input price, the lower the supply in the economy, and this will basically shift the supply curve to the left. Right? So when you increase the input prices, supply will reduce. Okay, and then the second part is in terms of productivity, and this is related very much to technology. Okay, so when technology increases, this will also increase productivity, right? So for example, if you have a machine, that machine can produce a certain amount of goods during a certain period. But now you buy a new machine with better technology, and because of that, you can reduce the input price, input cost, and also increase the amount of goods that you are producing. So this will, if the technology increase and productivity increase, this will increase the supply, right? So then supply will then shift to the right. Sorry, not supply, aggregate supply. Okay, aggregate supply. Okay. And then thirdly is the legal and institutional environment. So this is related to cost of doing business. Okay, so either you can say tax or bureaucracy. Okay, and then in terms of licenses, in terms of investment costs. So these are related to the legal and the institutional environment, and the regulatory costs. Okay, so the more friendly this environment, the more the aggregate supply. Okay, the more businesses will produce the goods and services in the economy. Okay, so yeah, so as you see, it can shift to the left or shift to the right. Okay, depending on the factors. Okay, and when we look more deeper in terms of the resource price just now, so it either can be the resource price of related to labor, for example, or capital or land. Okay, so labor, I want to highlight this because this just is very much relevant to Malaysia, right? So Malaysia just implemented a minimum wage of 1,500 starting this month. Okay, and many people were arguing that when you have a minimum wage, this will increase the resource price. Okay, and then many people are arguing that therefore, because of this, the cost of doing business is higher, and businesses are forced to increase the price of goods that they are producing. Okay, and therefore this cause inflation. So this is an argument. Okay, but the counter argument is that actually when people have more income, they can raise their well-being. Okay, and when their well-being is increased, then that will also influence the development of the country, right? And when you look at why inflation happens, is actually because of businesses making exuberant profits. And usually when cost of labor increase, they will shift the cost to the customer, when in actual fact, actually they do not need to do that because they can absorb it from their profits. right? When they increase the labor the labor wage, you can actually increase productivity as well. So there are many studies on this. Okay, so arguably in when you look at the research, in actual fact, minimum wage actually is good for the economy as a whole, and you can see the different researches that have been published on this topic. Okay, and then another aspect that I mentioned just now, capital. So this refers to the machines, okay, and the input, okay, the material. Okay, so this will influence the resource price, and also the third part is the land. So this is the premise, but also the raw material. Okay, the cost of the raw material, because land refers to not only the land that we see, but the things that are inside the land. Okay. Yeah, so these are factors. These three labor, capital, and land is usually the domestic price. Okay, but there's also the imported resources. Okay, for example, Malaysia maybe it's not applicable to us because we are actually not importing oil. We are exporting oil. Okay, but if we are importing oil, we are buying oil from another country, and this is a major component or major component of price of the supply, and therefore this will influence the supply in the economy. Okay, so if the imported oil price increase, for example, this will increase cost of production and therefore decrease aggregate supply. Okay, and another part which we mentioned just now in terms of the exchange rate. Okay, so if you are a business and you are buying things from you are buying raw material, for example, from overseas. Right, so if you are buying something from United States, okay, and when the ringgit depreciates, then the cost of production also will influence the supply. Right, so depending on the exchange rate, whether it appreciates and depreciates, this will influence this aggregate supply, and this will influence the cost of business, cost of production, and will also affect the aggregate supply. Okay. Yeah, and then just now in terms of productivity, I already mentioned this is related to technology, and you can calculate productivity. And I think most countries, they have figures in terms of the productivity. They have a calculation every year. I think let's just try to search the productivity of Malaysia. Yeah, so basically for Malaysia, it is calculated by the Department of Statistics. They have the labor productivity. Okay, so currently, so they calculate per, so this is they calculate in different sectors as well. Okay, so they can, based on the formula you can see in the in the um in the slides just now, they can show how much is actually each person, okay, on average is producing, okay, productivity related to producing, and how much is their contribution to the economy. Okay, so the calculation in quarter 4 2021, each person on average of the labor productivity is contributing 24,000, okay, on average. Okay, and this is an increase from the previous period, okay, of 1.7%, and you can compare. And basically what happened is, as you see here, in 2020, basically not only in Malaysia but all around the world, labor productivity decrease, okay, and at different sectors. So if you look at the blue line here, I think the blue line is, no, sorry, no, this is not representing sectors, this is representing the total employment. So the employment level similar, but in terms of the value added during 2020 reduced. Okay, so this was because of the lockdown. And then based on this period, you can see actually after the economy opened up, the productivity increased, but then we had another lockdown. Okay, we had another lockdown. This reduced again, but now we are picking up again in terms of productivity. Right, so you can search. I think most of the time, your country, different countries have different departments that calculate this. Okay, but basically you can calculate what is the productivity in the economy. Okay. Yeah,
Doctor,
and then
the productivity means what everyone has produced, or what?
what is the, yeah, you can, yeah, what everyone on average has produced. What is the contribution of everyone? Right, so it depends on various factors. Okay, so either, I think they have the explanation on how they calculate it in detail. Yeah, basically value added. Okay, value added per hour work. Okay, increment to the value of commodities and services by the manufacturing establishment. Okay, so basically it is the difference between output and input. Okay, so for example, if a business, like I mentioned just now, the clothing business, right? So they produce clothes, they produce shirts and pants. And let's say the cost of input, let's say, let's just try to draw this. Let's say the cost of input, yeah, so the cost of input, let's say the cotton. The cotton that they buy is 100,000. Okay, and then they process it in the factory. Okay, so in the factory they process it, and in this factory there's, let's say, 4 workers. Okay, and then when they produce from that factory, they can produce goods, or the shirts and pants are valued at RM, let's say 500,000. Okay, and here there is a difference of 400,000. Okay, so I'm just simplifying this. Yeah, the actual calculation may be different. Okay, but this is a way of looking at productivity. So when basically the difference of 400,000, you can argue that if everyone here, the four people that are working here are contributing almost the similar task. Okay, also on average, each person is contributing 100,000. Okay, so because there's 4 people, so each person on average is actually contributing 100,000, because the ratio, or the difference between the initial input to the output is 400,000, and when you divide to 4, basically on average is the 100,000. Right, so but of course there is various other ways, or more detailed ways of calculating this, but this is just to simplify. Right, so in this case, when you look at the productivity, basically it is 5/1. So you can argue that the productivity in this case is 5. Okay, and then you can also calculate the total input cost. Right, so here, if for whatever reason, right, so instead of maybe now they have better machines, the increase in technology. So let's represent this in blue. Okay, so they buy a new machine and there's an increase in technology. So they have the same input, they spend 100,000, but now because of the new technology, the output, the value of the output instead of 500,000 is now 1 million. Okay, so here you can argue that on average you can calculate 900,000 divide by 4. Okay, so here in terms of the productivity, or you can calculate, is actually 10 over 1. So the new productivity is 10, right? So there has been an increase in terms of the productivity. So in terms of the contribution, for each person on average has increased. So you can calculate this in the economy. And so they usually, the Department of Statistics will calculate what is actually the productivity on average per person. So those are the figures that they are showing in the poster just now, right? So hopefully that answers the question, right? Okay, brother.
Yes, doctor.
Okay. Yeah, and then finally, in terms of the legal and institutional environment, right, as I mentioned just now, in terms of the cost of doing business related to the tax, related to the subsidies, regulations, right? So this will also influence the aggregate supply. Okay. So when you add both aggregate supply and aggregate demand together, okay, you will get the equilibrium level in the economy. Okay, so in the equilibrium level in the economy here, in this case, is shown at this point. Okay, so at price level of 100, the GDP is 510. Okay, so there will be certain times, maybe depending on the situation, where in this case it is showing that the price level is below the equilibrium. Okay, so in this case at point A, the aggregate supply is at A. So the in the economy, supply is 502, but the demand is 514. Okay, so now what is happening is actually people are demanding more. Okay, people are demanding more, right? But the supply is not enough. Okay, so when this happens, usually this is where prices will increase. Okay, prices will increase. Why? Because in order to reach the equilibrium, right? Because now the demand is high, but the supply is not enough. So people will bid up prices. Okay, so people who demand it will increase the prices, and you can see the movement. Okay, so the demand will decrease because now people are demanding more. But so when you bid at a higher price, you will then reduce the amount demanded. Okay, so when you bid, right? So you imagine a bidding floor, right? So what you call the you know, the I think some of you have watched some videos of painting bidding, right? So the higher bidder will win, right? So the more higher the price, the less people can afford it, right? So in terms of demand, what happens is that in this situation, people will bid a higher price, and basically at a higher price, it will eliminate more bidders, right? So less demand will happen, and what happens is that a movement along the aggregate demand curve will move along this line. But also at the same time, because demand is high and supply is not enough, so now businesses will also start to increase supply, right? And this is incentivized if the price of goods increase. So when the price of goods increase, more businesses will supply more. because they can have a get a higher revenue when the price increase, and eventually they will always meet back at the equilibrium, right? So when there is a mismatch between aggregate demand and aggregate supply, usually there will be a situation that will correct it, right? So in this case, when the price increase, when there is a mismatch, aggregate supply and aggregate demand will move along the line, and eventually you see the price level also increase. Okay, so they will meet again at the equilibrium. So this usually, depending on the economic situation, will take different time periods. So it can be in the short run, or it can be at the longer run. Okay, but eventually the economy will meet back at the equilibrium. Okay. Okay, so there will be times where the equilibrium itself will change. Okay, and these are at different situations, and I think we've covered this a bit already. And basically, for example, equilibrium can change when aggregate demand shift to the right. Okay, when aggregate demand shift to the right, but aggregate supply doesn't change. Okay, so this is a special situation when aggregate demand shift to the right and aggregate supply doesn't change, and we've covered why where aggregate demand shifts. You can refer in the previous slides. Why do aggregate demand shift to the right? They are the factors that we mentioned just now. Okay, and when this happens, okay, basically price level will increase. Okay, when aggregate demand shift, price level will increase, and this is called the demand pull inflation. So when there is a general increase in the price level, inflation will happen. But in this case, inflation happens because there is a shift in the aggregate demand. Okay, so you can imagine someone pulling the aggregate demand curve higher. So they are pulling it to the right. So it's pulling it higher. Okay, so this happens when aggregate demand increases, but aggregate supply doesn't change. Okay, however, okay, you have to also be careful when you look at the change in prices. If aggregate demand increases, but at the same time aggregate supply also increase. Okay, aggregate demand increase, but aggregate supply also shift to the right. Okay, aggregate supply shift to the right. Okay, so AS2 now shifts to AS1 now shifts to AS2. Okay, so if only aggregate demand changes, okay, this is the equilibrium. However, now aggregate demand and aggregate supply changes, you can see that this is the equilibrium. AS2 and AD2, the equilibrium increases the quantity. However, the price level does not change. Okay, so however, depending on the shift of the aggregate supply, okay, so because we don't know actually how much is the shift, maybe the aggregate supply increase similar to aggregate demand, but it can also be higher than aggregate demand. So maybe AS2A. Okay, at this point, the price is actually lower than the original P1. Okay, or at this point, AS2B. Okay, it is also an increase, but at a lower level. Okay, but essentially the highlight here is that for this slide is actually just if the aggregate demand increases, okay, and the aggregate supply doesn't change, what happens is usually a demand pull inflation. Okay, and this is arguably to simplify, okay, or to simplify, one of the reasons of why inflation is currently happening around the world. Okay, there are various schools of thought. So in the US, mainly I think the Republicans are saying that this is happening because AD is shifting. Why? Because the US government gave too much money to people during the COVID. So they gave too much money to people, and people are spending too much, and the aggregate demand is shifting too much. Okay, so this is why demand pull inflation is happening in the US. Okay, but as we will see later, there's also other factors that cause inflation. Okay, yeah, and if the aggregate demand shifts to the left, this is where a recession will happen. Okay, usually this is where a recession will happen, and this is where you can argue what happens during the COVID lockdown, because consumption reduce. Okay, consumption reduce, investment reduce, government spending, we don't know, maybe, but net export also reduce. Okay, and then this basically reduce the aggregate demand in the economy and cause the recession. And when this happen, basically the output, the GDP output reduces, and the prices also, price level also reduce. So this is where usually a recession happen. But if you look at the textbook, definition of recession is when there is two consequent reduction in terms of output. Okay, so usually Q1 and Q2 there is a reduction of output, then you can categorize it as a recession. Okay, so so usually when aggregate demand shifts to the left, in this case, usually price level reduction from P1 to P2 is actually quite sticky. Okay, meaning to say that price level is very hard to reduce, but it's very easy to increase. Okay, price levels usually is very easy to increase, but when it comes to going down, is very inflexible. Okay, so this is related to price stickiness. So there are various factors why prices are downwardly inflexible. Okay, so some factors, for example, in terms of the price war. So price war is really when you think about businesses and they are selling the same thing. So if one business cut the price, other businesses will also cut the price, and this will cause a spiral effect, and eventually the businesses cut the price too much until everyone does not get a profit. Okay, because they cut the price too much, right? So this is a cost of war. Okay, but eventually the cost of war, there will be one victor, right? So when you cut the price, all the other businesses will be killed, but there will only be one victor. But you don't know whether you are the one that will be victorious or not. So usually businesses are afraid to cut the price. Okay, and then there is the menu cost, referring to the menu. For example, if you go to the restaurant, the price and in the menu is already printed. So usually there is a cost to reprint the menu, okay, or the change the price. Okay, so therefore businesses are reluctant to do that. And then in terms of wages as well, usually there's already agreement in terms of the contract, so it's not easy to cut the wage of your workers, right? Because of the contracts. And then there is the efficiency wages, and also the minimum wage law. So you can't cut below the minimum wage law. And then you can't also easily cut the wages, because if you cut the wages, it will also reduce the efficiency in the economy. Okay, so that's why when prices are supposed to go down, businesses are reluctant to reduce the price. Okay, so these are just the reason why sometimes, although the economy is doing bad, prices do not change. But when the economy is doing good, prices can easily change. Right? Prices can easily go up, but when the economy is doing bad, prices remain the same. Okay, so this is recession. Okay, and there is also, just now we looked at demand pull inflation caused by the shift in aggregate demand. Okay, now there is a cost push inflation that is caused by a shift in aggregate supply to the left. And this is basically, as the name says, because of the cost. Okay, now because cost of input, for example, okay, and the cost of doing business is higher, businesses eventually reduce the amount that is supplied, and also because of reduction of supply, price levels also increase. Price levels also increase, and this is what is termed as cost push inflation. Okay, and this is the other school of thought of what is currently happening right now globally because of the increase in cost of doing business, especially when you look at the lockdown in China and the disruption in the supply chain. Okay, whereby China is not exporting their goods, right? And not only China, other countries as well. Okay, and there are other factors like the war in Ukraine, right? So when that happens, it basically increased the cost of inputs, and when the cost of inputs increase and there is a disruption to the supply of inputs, this will also cause a decrease in aggregate supply globally. Okay, and you can argue basically both the cost push inflation and demand pull inflation is happening at the same time right now, right? So there is also both things are happening at the same time, and when this happens, okay, AD2, okay, so the new equilibrium, I think here, sorry, so AD2 here, so the new equilibrium is at P3. So when both cost push inflation and demand pull inflation happens at the same time, the inflation will be much higher. Okay, the price level change will be much higher. Okay, so aggregate supply can also increase, right, because of the higher employment levels. Okay, in this case is full employment, and basically for an economy, okay, the aim is to move this, okay, to move to the right in terms of GDP figures. Okay, so in order to move to the right, okay, there must be the role of both AD and ES. So AD and ES must always be shifted to the right. So when they both move to the right, eventually, you know, the levels of GDP will increase. Okay, and if you move further to the right, you shift further to the right, so the GDP progressively increases. So this is the aim of the economy. You want to demand more, but also supply more. So you can do that by targeting a price level. So as long as the price does not go over, for example, price max and not lower than price minimum, okay, and AD and ES, the equilibrium is within this maximum and minimum, and they progress to the right, it should be progressive or a sustainable, not sustainable, it should be a good trajectory for the GDP of the country. Okay, so this is the aim. Okay, and you can do this by having full employment. Full employment means that your labor, the labor force, everyone that wants a job has a job, and they are productive. And the more productive, of course, you can increase the supply. And when you increase the supply, you can have better wages. You can have better income. When you have better wages, you have better income. You can increase the AD. Right? So this is a what you call a circular flow. Right? So when that happens, you can increase the amount of output in the economy. Okay. I think we have already covered this in terms of the recession. What happened was that there was a housing collapse and banking failure, and then the government had fiscal and monetary policy. So we will cover this, I think, next week. So government spending, fiscal policy, and quantitative easing was the monetary policy. Okay, and this is arguably the same thing that happened for the COVID stimulus. Okay, and this is related to your assignment. Okay, so remember your assignment wants to look at the government response to after COVID happened. Okay, so if you haven't started on that, you can start immediately, and hopefully you can also get some ideas during the class. Okay, but the due date is by the end of the month, so you have to do your own study before I cover it in class. Okay, and you can read a lot of reports on that. Okay, so yeah, I think that's it. That's it for the topic today. So it's just on aggregate demand and aggregate supply, and the factors that influence aggregate demand and aggregate supply, and also the effects of the shift of aggregate demand and aggregate supply. Okay, so hopefully you get the idea of how then this will influence the economy, and can start to relate it to the various economic concepts. Okay, so before I end, is there any questions?
Doctor,
Yes.
Aggregate demand and aggregate supply is very much simple to demand and supply that we have learned in the previous class.
In micro, yeah, but the factors are different. The factors that influence demand and the factors that influence aggregate demand are different.
Okay.
And the factors that influence supply and the factors that influence aggregate supply is different. Okay, and the effects are different as well. Okay, when the demand and supply shift, we don't relate it to GDP. But in this case, we relate it to GDP, and we also relate it to inflation. And
thank you.
And productivity and output. Right, so that's the distinction there. Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. Any other questions? Okay, so again, before I end, I would highly recommend that you start on your assignments. Okay, don't say that I haven't warned you, because the assignment will be due by the end of the month. Okay, and there will be 2 assignments just for this subject. Okay, and of course later on you will encounter more assignments from different subjects as well. Okay, so hopefully you can start immediately, and if you have any questions or you need any assistance related to the subject or the assignment, feel free to contact me. Okay, so if there's no other question, I think we can end the class today. Yeah, so we can end with tasbih kifarat suratul asr. Subhanakallahumma wa bihamdika asyhadu an la ilaha illa anta astaghfiruka wa atubu ilaik. Wal asri innal insana lafi khusr illa alladhina amanu wa amilus solihat wa tawasaw bil haqq wa tawasaw bis sabr. Okay, thank you very much everyone. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullah.